Emelie Swackhamer is a horticulture extension educator at Penn State University. She holds a bachelor's in plant science from Penn State and a master's in plant pathology from North Carolina State University. Emelie is an expert on the new invasive insect, the spotted lanternfly. Welcome, Emelie.
Thank you, Grace. Well, it's really fun to be here and to have a chance to talk to this audience. I know there's people from a wide range of places out there, but I think a lot of people probably from the DC and Washington area. And what I'm going to cover today is what you need to know about spotted lanternfly, and then give you some idea about how we're fighting it in Pennsylvania and in other states. So I'm part of Penn State Extension. We're a college of the ag. We're a branch of the College of Agricultural Sciences, and we provide research-based information. Every state has an extension service, so if you're not familiar with them, you might want to find out who they are and use their information. So we're talking about spotted lanternfly today. This is an invasive pest. It's a plant hopper. So it is native to Asia, but it was found in southeastern Pennsylvania for the first time in 2014, for the first time ever in the Western Hemisphere. It has now spread to 11 states, and it has been detected in at least 3 additional states. So the place to know, to find out where lanternfly exists is the New York State IPM program map. And you can find that really easily by a Google search. And they keep this map up to date as new discoveries are made. So you can see the blue area is where spotted lanternfly infestations are known to exist. And then there are some also purple dots on this map where there have been individual detections, but of course, people have gone there and really looked for lanternfly, and they don't believe that there is an established infestation in those areas yet. So this map illustrates one really important point. That is that the insect is spreading, but you see some of these far-flung counties in states that are not, where the blue areas are not connected. Humans have moved spotted lanternfly around and started new infestations. And that's part of what you need to know about it. There are quarantines in place, and we want to make sure that people aren't spreading it around unintentionally. So in case you're wondering about where it may be able to survive in the United States, this is from a study that was published in 2019. And this map shows the country, and the orange areas are where there's very high likelihood that spotted lanternfly will be able to survive. So, and then the yellow and green, goes down the gradient of how well the scientists believe they can survive there. So this map took into account weather data, altitude, presence of host plants, that we'll talk about some of them, and like length of the summer, things like that. So you can see that the mid-Atlantic, the Midwest, going into like the grape growing regions of New York, there's a lot of concern about that and the other areas. And then also we believe it would survive very well on the West Coast. So, we're concerned about the crops that are grown in these areas. And this was done kind of early on, and I would say I wouldn't be surprised if there are changes to this map as we know more about the insect. So just to bring it home for Pennsylvania, when it was first discovered, immediately we had great concern about some crops that were at risk. We know that lanternfly loves grapes. Our grape crop is valued at $4.8 billion a year in Pennsylvania. PA is the #1 exporter of hardwoods in the country, and our forest products value $19 billion per year. Nursery and landscape production is valued at $944 million per year. So we were concerned about these commodities immediately. And every state has, their own set of economic values assigned to their crops. So before I get into all the details about this, I just want to say you don't have to try to write everything down. The information that I'm presenting is pretty much available on the Penn State Extension Spotted Lanternfly website. And I've pointed out 3 particularly good fact sheets that we've updated very recently: our Spotted Lanternfly Management Guide. We have management for landscape professionals and vineyards as well, But there's videos, there's all kinds of offerings on our website. And if you'd rather call somebody and talk to them, you can call our 1-888 number, and it's cleverly for bad fly, and the numbers are there. So if you're more of a phone person and like to talk to someone, you can use that line as well. Okay, so I mentioned the quarantine. What does it mean? Well, just to summarize it all up, no one may intentionally move viable life stages of spotted lanternfly. And that pretty well sums up the quarantines that any of the states that have enacted them have in place. So in Pennsylvania, this applies to residents. It applies to everybody. We have a checklist on our website where you can print it off. It gives you on the front pictures of the different life stages to help you identify it. And then on the back, you can check off what you're moving and what you've inspected. Any object that's been outside potentially could be moving lanternfly around. And I'll show you what that could look like in pictures. And then you sign it, and that is your way of making sure that you're following the quarantine order. So businesses also in Pennsylvania are required to have a spotted lanternfly permit. And many of our surrounding states also are requiring that. So you can go to the Penn State Extension website and find a few other states where you can take the permit test. But if you don't know how to do that, really the regulatory agency is your Department of Agriculture. So go to your state's Department of Ag, and it's pretty prominent on all the websites. In Pennsylvania, the way it works, you watch a recorded class, you take a quiz, you have to pass the quiz with a 70%, and then you're issued your permit. Getting the permit is just the first part of the process. The permit ensures that you're knowledgeable about the problem and you've been trained in knowing how to inspect things and what to look for. Following through, though, on the inspections is really the most important part. So we want people to inspect objects before they move them and destroy any living life stages that might be on those objects. And then in Pennsylvania, there's a record-keeping requirement. You have to keep like a vehicle log. So this is for commercial businesses and agencies. You want to check into this if you're in a state where quarantine has been enacted. So one of the main things I want to do today is to show you what the life cycle is and help you with identification characteristics. So if you see it coming into your area, you will be able to identify it and act appropriately, meaning please report it to the probably the Department of Ag in your state. So I'll start up here at the egg stage because we're in the winter right now. And this is the only life stage that will overwinter. The eggs are covered by the female with putty-like substance, and that's what you see in this drawing. I'm going to show you real pictures next. But the eggs they start to lay them really in the end of September in our area, and then they can be present and hatching. They start to hatch in May and into June. So, so hatch and first instar, well, really in warmer parts of Pennsylvania, we have seen hatch as early as April, and they'll hatch going into June. And then the insect will continue to grow, and as it goes through its stages, we call those instars. So each time it sheds its skin, it's a new instar. The first 3 nymphal stages or instars are black with white spots. And then the 4th one has this beautiful red coloration, and you see they're getting bigger and bigger as this goes on. Incidentally, this insect can jump. So even in these small nymphal stages, they jump like superheroes. It's not only the adults that will jump. So the adults start to emerge around September, and it's an incomplete metamorphosis. So they don't have a cocoon or pupa or stage or anything like that. The exoskeleton of the 4th instar just splits open and the adult stage crawls out. The adults are present from July and up until the first hard frost. That will kill them. So most years in Pennsylvania, they've been dying in November, but we've had a couple years where they didn't die until December. And then they will lay eggs. So they lay eggs starting in September and going up until that first killing frost. So getting familiar with what these life stages looks like is really important. And egg masses are the stage that is present for the longest time throughout the year. And it's likely that they are the most easily transported. So I want to make sure you know how to identify them. The female spotted lanternfly lays her eggs in rows, and the rows are arranged just next to each other like this. There's an average of about 35 eggs per mass, but it can vary pretty widely. She will then usually cover them with a substance from her body. It's almost like a putty consistency. It's waxy in nature. And the female will cover her eggs. Most of the time she covers the whole egg mass, but sometimes she misses a few eggs, and she'll have some eggs protruding out of, underneath the covering. Sometimes you can find egg masses like the one on the left, they're completely uncovered. So the egg mass covering, when it comes out of her body, it's white and wet, and it dries down pretty quickly to a mud-like color. And as the season progresses, it starts to develop these cracks. If the rainwater washes some of the egg mass covering off, you can see the eggs kind of through this one. You get these weathered looking egg masses. So these are all spotted lanternfly egg masses that vary in their appearance, and it's important to be able to recognize them. So here's a picture, out in nature. This is a tree of heaven, one of their favorite hosts, and the females often like to lay their eggs in protected sites. So this was where the trunk of the tree was coming out of the side of a bank, and it kind of had, a protection there, and it was like a warm exposure. And you can see the females love to lay their eggs there. There's a lot of egg masses on that tree. So the problem is the lanternfly will lay their eggs on any solid object. This is a rock that there are 5 egg masses on the underside of this rock. And this is a bench that I turned over, and then you're looking at the underside of the bench and you see all of the egg masses that are on the bench. So of course the danger is that somebody moves this bench to a new area and then the eggs hatch in the spring. This is a picture where it shows that they'll lay their eggs on the rubber of tires and also on rusty metal. This one is really kind of scary because if lanternflies lay their eggs on something that has wheels that you can drive down the road, it has potential to be spread a long distance on vehicles. So inspect any outdoor objects. So then the eggs hatch and you get this nymphal stage that's black with the white spots, and there's 3 instars in that coloration. This is shown on a wild grape. And then this is looking at the 4th instar, and this is a video that shows a really high population on this tree. And this was a young tree. It just must have had a really good food source for them. They're able to put their mouth parts into the tree and feed on the sap. And you can just see how many there were. And these high populations are really quite a nuisance in the landscape. So this shows then the adult stage, which starts to appear in July. And this is shown on one of their favorite trees, the tree of heaven, Altissima, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But this is a tree that they particularly like. Here, the adults are using their mouth parts to pierce through the bark of the tree and feed on the sap. That's how they feed. And you can see there's wounds that are weeping. So you see that dark sap coming down the trunk a little bit. And as they're feeding, they pull a lot of sap into their bodies, and they're kind of inefficient in how they use, the sap as a food source, and they pull in more than they really need for the sugar content, and they'll excrete partially digested tree sap in the form of a substance that we call honeydew, and that honeydew has a lot of sugar content to it. So the honeydew will collect under any lanternfly that's feeding, and in large groups it collects in large quantities. And there are fungi that will grow on that honeydew, and collectively we call that sooty mold. And you can see that kind of black deposit growing on top of the honeydew all underneath these trees. Now on Tree of Heaven, it's not unusual to also find kind of a white foamy substance at the bottom of these areas. And that is a collection of yeasts and some other microorganisms that are also using that honeydew as a food source. So these areas have lots of rather large insects. The insects do hop around and they will land on you. They're not shy of people. They won't bite or sting, but they're in their own right. They're just icky to have in your landscape. We are trying to figure out what this does to the health of trees, and I have some slides to show you what we do know about that. There are also stinging insects like yellow jackets and some other relatives that love the honeydew, and they'll come and collect that sweet substance. So these areas tend to be buzzing with stinging insects, another thing that you don't really want in your landscape. So I have this video to show you, like an action shot of what this really looks like. This is the bottom of a tree of heaven. You can see the honeydew and sooty mold accumulation. And then as I pan up, you see the lanternflies. There are stinging insects swarming around this tree. This is a midsummer, late summer kind of scene. And when this is in a landscape, it's really objectionable near your patio or your deck. So now I've shown you what the different life stages look like, but we still get questions about things that people aren't sure what they're seeing. And I want to point out a really good resource from Virginia Cooperative Extension. They have developed 3 fact sheets of possible lookalikes. So here is their lookalike sheet for egg masses, and they show pictures of lanternfly eggs, but also some other things that have been confused for lanternfly eggs. They have a sheet for lookalikes for nymphs and another sheet for lookalikes for adults. These are really great educational pieces, very easy to find. And if you're teaching people about lanternfly, it might be something you want to include. So lanternfly has a broad host range. They definitely have a set of plants that they prefer, and these are plants to look for them on if you're searching. But really, we have found them on almost anything, and they seem to be able to feed on almost anything if they need to. So they really like tree of heaven, and I referred to that before. This is an invasive tree that was brought here many years ago from Asia. It's a really tough tree. It likes disturbed sites. It's often found along roadsides and transportation corridors. And it kind of makes sense. This tree is from Asia. This is an insect that came from Asia, and this insect really loves tree of heaven. So, but other things to look for lanternfly on would be grape, black walnut. They really like black walnut, and especially the young new growth of the black walnuts when they're in their nymphal stage. They like silver and red maple, but other maples as well. They like river birch, willow, staghorn sumac, but other trees. I want to note that we have not really seen substantial feeding on conifers like pines and spruce. We have seen them on those trees. They will lay their eggs on those trees, but we have not seen them really feeding or causing any kind of damage to those trees. So as you're looking for lanternfly, another thing that's kind of unique about this insect is that it will move from plant to plant. So many insects that feed on one particular host, you'll only ever find them on that host. But lanternfly is different. So in the spring of the year, we often find them on roses and perennials, tender plants. The mouth parts of the nymphs are tender, and they feed on the succulent parts of the plant. Then as they get older, they can move to other plants. We certainly can find them on grape or tree of heaven all season long. But I mentioned nymphs really like black walnut, and that also butternut, another jubilant species. Later in the season, they'll move to the river birch and the willow, the staghorn sumac. But very later in the season, if you look on red maple, you often find them. So they have this strange behavior of moving in the landscape. If you're looking for lanternfly, though, you really can watch tree of heaven. That'll give you a really good shot of finding if it's in your area. So the tree of heaven, Ailanthus altissima, it's this invasive tree that was brought here from Asia. I just want to show you some identification characteristics. It has pinnately compound leaves. That means the leaf on the bottom picture here, that is one leaf. So in this case, it's almost 1 meter long. It has many leaflets. It has a smooth leaf margin. So here on the blow up, you see that smooth margin, but they do have these lobes at the base of the leaflet. So here's 1 and here's 2. And the other way to tell this plant is to crush the foliage or break the stems and smell them. And they really smell like rotten peanut butter, and very distinctive, kind of objectionable smell. So identify tree of heaven watch Tree of Heaven. Tree of Heaven is an invasive weed in its own right. So if you can get rid of Tree of Heaven, that's probably a good practice. And hopefully you're diminishing the amount of food that's available for the lanternfly. And hopefully you won't have such high populations develop if you've done that. So early on in the lanternfly infestation, there was some speculation. People wondered if lanternfly required Tree of Heaven, Ailanthus altissima, as a host in order to complete their life cycle. This is some research that was recently done at Penn State that where they tracked lanternfly development in enclosures that had a variety of trees. Some of the enclosures had Tree of Heaven, Ailanthus, in them. Some of the enclosures did not. So the blue bars show with Ailanthus, and here they're counting egg masses as the season goes on, and they get to 29 egg masses. And without Ailanthus, though, disappointingly, they were able to complete their life cycle and lay eggs, and those eggs were viable. So we now no longer hope that getting rid of Ailanthus will totally get rid of lanternfly. Hopefully it's going to reduce the numbers that are able to build up, because they're not going to be able to lay as many eggs and be as fit without it. So just to quick address some of the myths, these are rather large insects and people get fearful of them. Spotted lanternfly does not bite or sting people. So they really don't have the ability to do that. They don't have mouth parts that can chomp, and they don't try to feed on human flesh. So spotted lanternfly also does not eat structures. It doesn't do any damage, physical damage to the wood of homes or anything like that. But the picture shows that they will congregate on the sides of buildings, especially in the fall, on those days where you have a warm exposure there. They tend to go to that warmth. So they don't really hurt structures, but they can cause cosmetic damage. This is a picture that someone in our area took of the bottom of the steps that are off their deck. And this was under a river birch tree that had lots of lanternfly feeding on it, spitting out the honeydew. The sooty mold is growing. And this is what it was doing to their decking. And the top two steps is what it looked like, that shiny honeydew and sooty mold. And then the bottom step, they had just pressure washed. And you can see the pressure wash pattern in here. So it's really hard to get that sooty mold out of the decking material. And, so this could be considered cosmetic structural damage. In that case, that would be appropriate to start considering what kind of management options you want to implement to control this on that particular tree. All right, so one of their favorite hosts are grapes. And I'm going to show you this video. This was taken by one of our graduate students, where the lanternflies in the fall were feeding on the vines of the grapes. And they've got their mouth parts into the sap conducting elements, and you can see the sooty or the honeydew coming out of the body of that insect, just squirting out. So the honeydew is getting on the grapes. It can affect the quality of the grapes. It's also taking the sugars from the plant, and you want the sugars to go into the grapes in the fall. So as we learned more about it, we recognize that heavy feeding on grapes like this can lead the vines to die over the winter. So it reduces their ability to withstand the winter. And this is a picture that I took in Berks County, Pennsylvania in October of 2019. This is a block of vines. The cultivar is Gewürztraminer, and they were all killed by heavy lanternfly feeding. So if you look on the hillside on the back, you can see there's other cultivars of grapes in this vineyard that had not been affected as much, but certainly their yield may be reduced and their vigor can be affected. So we gathered up some economic information about the impact on grapes. And so I'll just read these off to you. In 2017, we had a 90% yield loss in a 40-acre planting that was documented. In 2018, we had a 100% death of an 8-acre Pinot Noir planting. And from 2016 to 2018, a 45% yield reduction in a 10-acre Chardonnay planting. So we also documented increases in insecticide costs and labor, and this was from 5 vineyards. So the number of insecticide applications increased from an average of 4.2 applications to 14. The growers were just trying to keep the insects off their vines at that critical time of year. And this increased the average insecticide cost by 171% for that producer. So this is a huge problem. Our farms are run on pretty thin margins, and they just can't incur costs like this to protect their vines. So they're looking for other solutions. So for management in grapes, you can certainly use mechanical methods where you're scouting the vineyards and scraping and destroying egg masses in the winter to prevent them from ever being able to hatch. There's been some research done collaboratively on these farms using netting to exclude the insects. And on the picture there, you can see the netting is very closely tied on the base and, secured on the bottom so the lanternflies can't get in there. When you see bird netting in vineyards, they usually just hang it over the vines and the birds aren't inclined to go under it as much. So look for that very closed configuration to know if they're trying to discourage lanternflies. And then there are, of course, insecticides that can kill lanternfly. They're really not that hard to kill with insecticides, and we have some very good efficacy information from research-based studies. So, I just show you this table. It's on our vineyard management fact sheet. But if you were growing grapes, especially commercially, you'd want to know what this information was, and then you could choose your methods of trying to control them. So they damage grapes, and grapevines have died. We're seeing economic damage there, but what about trees? Well, this is a picture of Tree of Heaven, and Tree of Heaven are the only trees that we have seen die from lanternfly pressure so far. So this is an area in a forest that the area was logged probably 15 years before this picture was taken. And what comes up in some of these areas are Tree of Heaven because it's so invasive. So this old forest is all young Tree of Heaven, and the lanternfly fed really heavily on these Tree of Heaven for 2 years, and some of them started to die. So we did find evidence of other secondary invaders, in particular, in this case, borers. So borers are often attracted to weakened trees. And we have seen evidence of other secondary invaders in Tree of Heaven that were killed by spotted lanternfly, notably some of the root rot fungi, like Armillaria Emelie. But we have not seen lanternfly kill other trees. So we summarized what we know of tree damage, and this is from Dr. Kelly Hoover's lab. We have seen wilted or dead branches. The picture on the top shows a walnut tree, and this is where they will feed in these high numbers of nymphs on the succulent new growth, and they will just drain, all the sap out of that branch, and we can get wilting or dead branches there. We have seen wilting and dead branches on some other trees, staghorn sumac, on maple, on willow. You get weeping wounds on the tree. I showed you a picture of what that looked like, where they pierce the bark and the sap will flow out. It could take a nursery, a producer, longer to grow saleable size trees. So if the lanternfly is pulling the sap out and taking some of the energy away from the tree's not able to put that into new growth. And that translates into a longer turnover time for crop production, which also has economic impact on those producers. In very high numbers of lanternfly, we know it stresses trees. So Dr. Hoover's lab has documented a reduction in photosynthesis and carbohydrate stores, and that can make the trees more vulnerable to these additional stressors. But we're really just starting to learn about that. More work is being done. And then the honeydew and the sooty mold accumulation can block the photosynthesis of understory trees, and that could have implications for our forests and native plants. So that's not a good situation either. It's extremely hard to document this sort of thing and do this work, and I really have to commend the scientists that are working on it. So people will ask about biological control. Are there things out there that will eat lanternfly? And yeah, we're learning more about this all the time. So we know spiders will catch them in their webs and eat them. We know praying mantids will eat them. And we know some of the other predators like the assassin bugs, this is a wheel bug, will eat them. And, we get a lot of people enjoy finding this and, it's fun to watch. And we get a lot of people that tell us that they've observed this activity. We really don't believe that this is causing a great decline in their populations at this time. But again, it's another thing that's really hard to measure. So there are some other possibilities for biological control. This is a picture of a tiny little parasitic wasp. So you see the measurement bar there that's 0.5 millimeter. So this whole tiny wasp is like 1 millimeter long, really tiny. You'd hardly ever notice these are even there. But there are tiny parasitic wasps that have been found to lay their eggs in the eggs of lanternfly, and then the developing wasp larva will kill the egg, the developing lanternfly egg. And there's also a tiny parasitic wasp that we know of from Asia that will lay their eggs in the nymphs of lanternfly, and then the developing wasp will kill the lanternfly nymph. So this sort of work, again, it's very difficult to do. We're looking for things that are already here. And if you ever see anything interesting, let somebody know. And there probably is a researcher that is interested in your discovery. But you can't just go to other parts of the world and bring things like these tiny parasitic wasps to, new areas because of the potential off-target effects. There's a group of the U.S. Department of Ag that's working very hard on 2 different tiny parasitic wasps that have potential to be used as biological control for spotted lanternfly. They got them from the lanternfly's native range in Asia, but they're in a quarantine facility and they're trying to do all the tests that are required. And that sort of work is very difficult. So I don't think that we're going to have results from that anytime soon, but I'm really glad that somebody's doing that work. And then another interesting biological control possibility are the fungal pathogens. This is a picture that was taken of lanternfly carcasses that were found that were killed by naturally occurring fungus Beauveria bassiana. The fungus Beauveria bassiana is formulated and available as a pesticide product, as an insecticide, and it's labeled for use. We often use it in greenhouses, but some of the products are labeled for use in landscapes and ornamental trees. Now you have to follow the pesticide laws in your particular state, but if it's legal to use in your state, you can try it. But we don't have research-based information to say that it is really working for sure. So it's not part of our recommendations at this time. Stay tuned. I'm hoping that we're going to keep discovering potential biological controls and hopefully be able to use them in the future. So when we talk to people about lanternfly and what they should do on their own property, it's a really big conversation. So every situation is different and there's no one size fits all answer. So my coworker, Amy Corman, and I came up with this graphic to try to explain how we talk people through it. First, we asked them to consider how many lanternflies are present. What is the level? Is it an intolerable level? A real nuisance? Is it an undesirable level? And we use the word tolerable kind of loosely here. In Pennsylvania, where it's been present for a long time, a few egg masses, nymphs or adults may be tolerable. If it's in an area where you have never found lanternfly before, no one's ever found it, even one is not tolerable. So that's, it needs a little explanation. Is the severity low? So get an idea of how bad is it and kind of where you are in the country. And then think about what plants are present. So do you have very few of those favorite plants that they love? Or do you have many of those favorite plants? Are your plants already under stress from other factors, which might make them even more damaged by the feeding? And what proximity do you have to vulnerable plants like vineyards or nursery production? And then you try to, figure out where you are in this continuum. Maybe you decide, well, I'm at low risk and I'm not going to do any drastic control measures. Maybe you decide I'm at very high risk, and then you kind of go for the the more aggressive treatment regimes. And again, this is a decision for every situation. It depends on where you are in the country. If you're finding lanternfly in an area where it's never been before, this has different meaning for you. And then we came up with this way of trying to help people think about what their possibilities are. And it's a pyramid or a staircase of integrated pest management. So as you go up the levels, the environmental impact and the cost may increase. So we have cultural control things. I've already mentioned, removing things like tree of heaven. You want to promote your plant health. Don't assume all damage is from spotted lanternfly. Get somebody to really diagnose the problem that can help you with that. You can use physical or mechanical methods, and I'm going to show you pictures of these. So scraping and smashing eggs, tree traps, biological controls, promote the habitat and try to encourage them, but we're not suggesting releasing any biological controls at this time. And then there are different insecticide options. The least toxic options work pretty well. Things like insecticidal soap, neem, botanical oils, pyrethrum, but they have very little residual activity. And then, there are some stronger things you can use, or you can hire people to do work for you to protect trees. And there are contact sprays where you have to get the spray on the body of the insect or have them walk into it, where it's sprayed on a tree and they're moving. Or you can use systemic products. The systemic products get absorbed by the roots of the tree and make the whole tree toxic to the lanternfly. The systemics especially tend to have longer residual activity, and it can be a good way to protect certain trees that are important in landscapes and make sure that it's a tree labeled for use, that pesticide is labeled for use on. So the other thing to consider when you're trying to put together this management puzzle is, what time of year is it? So we have on our Spotted Lanternfly guide the calendar year, and then all of the different options that would be effective depending on the month. So, all year long, you don't want to move any life stages of spotted lanternfly. You can scrape and destroy eggs when the eggs are present. You can try spraying eggs with a dormant rate of horticultural spray oil when the eggs are present again, and the research was done in the spring period, so that's reflected on our chart. You can, and I'll show you pictures, you can use circle traps, you can use contact insecticides or systemic insecticides. And, again, it's a complicated management picture, and you have to figure out what works best for your situation and your needs. All right, let me show you pictures of what some of these management practices look like. This is scraping eggs. So you can use anything, a credit card or, a knife, butter knife. Scrape the egg masses into a container and put rubbing alcohol in the container. You can use hand sanitizer that has rubbing alcohol in it as well, or ethyl alcohol, and that will kill the eggs. If you don't have a scraper and a container and alcohol, you can just smash those eggs and they pop and you know that you've destroyed them. It's kind of fun. It's a little messy, but it's kind of fun. You can scrape and smash eggs. However, researchers looked into this and they cut down some trees and counted egg masses to figure out where they were on the trees. And they found out that about 90% of spotted lanternfly egg masses on those trees were above 10 feet high and you can't reach them. So you can do it. It's good to do. And every lanternfly that you destroy in the egg stage doesn't go on to breed and mate and lay eggs later. So you are having some effect on the population, but you're not going to clean a whole property this way. So this question comes up about destroying eggs with oil sprays. And the research of this has been variable, and it's not something that we're saying with confidence that it's, like a sure thing. So for one reason, most of the eggs are above where you can reach. And if you don't have spray equipment, then you can really get up there. You're not going to treat them. The research was done with little spray bottles, like hand spray bottles, with complete coverage of the egg masses. And big tree sprayers, you may not get that kind of coverage on the eggs that are up high. The eggs are also laid on other materials around the property. So, if you're spraying a tree, you're going to miss some of the eggs. So we're saying you can do this. You might be able to kill some of the eggs, but it's not a real strong recommendation for any kind of total control. So a lot of people in the beginning were using sticky bands, and these are, in this case, this is a fly paper. And the nymphs have this curious behavior. They get blown out of the trees and they land on the ground, and they'll go to a tree or stem and they'll walk back up. They need to find a place to feed. And when their mouth parts are young and tender, they have to go to the leaves where the succulent parts of the plants are. So people have used sticky bands. And as they crawl up the tree, the tree bands would fill from the bottom going up. Well, there's a major drawback to this method, and that is that you can catch other creatures. So we don't want anybody to catch any other creatures, you know, and if you do, it's probably not going to be a good experience. So we're saying if you use sticky bands, you have to cover that band. We're recommending using window screening to build a wildlife barrier, and it will protect the band somewhat from other insects as well that you don't want to catch. The opening, of course, the bottom, of course, has to be open so the lanternflies can crawl up into there. And then, you know, the idea is to catch them and check the bands frequently and change them. But we're really not, we're hoping people don't use sticky bands in a lot of cases. There's a better way. So there's an apparatus called a circle trap. And this is similar to like a minnow trap. And the bottom of it, I can show you in this picture, it makes like an apron or a skirt, and the lanternfly nymphs climb up in there, and then they go through this funnel and they get into the collection container and they can't find their way out. So this doesn't capture very many other creatures that you don't want to catch. There's a homemade type that you can make yourself, and there's a commercial one that you can buy. So if you want to build your own circle trap, we have a fact sheet on our Spotted Lanternfly website, and it's easy to find on there. And it shows how you can build them out of materials that you might already have around the house. And people have had pretty good success with catching a lot of lanternflies on these circle traps. They're also good for monitoring. If you have one of their favorite trees and you put a circle trap on that tree and keep watching it, if you're looking for lanternflies, sometimes it's a good way to find them as they come into a new area. So I want to remind everybody, if you get lanternflies and you decide you're going to use some sort of insecticide, please don't use home remedies. So the inclination is to find something in the household or under the sink or in the garage, something like this that sprays. And none of these are labeled as insecticides. So we're saying don't use them. They may be unsafe for humans, pets. They may burn the leaves of your plants. And technically, this is an illegal use of these products. They're not labeled as insecticides. Better to use labeled insecticides. Even the soft things like insecticidal soap can work pretty well. So just some observations from this past year. In the area where lanternfly was first discovered, we've started to see fluctuations in the population. So we had fewer lanternflies this year than we've had in early years. And people are asking, well, what's affecting their population levels? So this is kind of how I think about it. Certainly host plant availability and health affects the numbers that can build. The weather conditions can have effects, and then natural enemies. And these conditions all intersect. So for example, those naturally occurring fungi, they really thrive when the weather conditions are wet because they're fungi and they like a lot of moisture. So that's where the intersection of these two components can happen. But there are other factors that can affect their populations. Certainly people are taking control measures. So if they're reducing the populations, the year before, you're likely to see fewer the next year. And then there's all this population density and dynamics that go on in insect populations as well. So we don't know yet if they get to be really high populations. One year, if they have some sort of behavior where they try to disperse like other insects do. That's unknown. And we're trying to learn as much as we can about all these different factors. But at the moment, we don't understand how they're interacting, and we're not able to use them in any way to predict lanternfly populations. So more research is needed. This is a picture of one of the research plots that the Penn State people are doing. This is Dr. Kelly Hoover's work. And she and her lab constructed enclosures, and they have a variety of plants in these enclosures, and they've done a lot of work. A lot of good information has come out of these, but it takes time. You know, you need the land, and you need enough insects to do the work, and you have to get established trees. It's hard to do this kind of work in a controlled setting on larger plant material. So one of the messages to take home is, if you find lanternfly, report it. So even people in areas where it's been, you know, for several years, we still want Pennsylvanians to report lanternfly because our Department of Agriculture and our researchers are using that information. So we're saying in Pennsylvania, if you can report it just once in the season, you don't need to report every time you see one in these areas where, you know, there are a lot of them. But if you report it just once in the season, that's really useful information for a lot of people. So whatever state you're in, the Department of Agriculture is collecting that information. You can also probably report it to your extension service. If you're in DC, you can report it to the Urban Forestry Division, District Department of Transportation. And I put their link in there, their website. And it's really easy to find. And that's just a clip from the first page that comes up. And they have really useful pictures of the different life stages. And then the red buttons say, you know, this is what I saw, and it will take you to where you report. So Penn State Extension shares information with the other states. So if you want to go to the Penn State Extension website, we have a report button there. We also have that 1-888-4-BAD-FLY number. And if you report it either way there and you're out of Pennsylvania, that information gets shared with the state that you're in. So the states are working together. So we know we have a long road ahead of us with this insect. This is one of the research plots that's being used. It's a street that's lined with red maple. There's 50 trees on this site. They're all the same cultivar. They're all the same age. And, you know, we're looking for sites like this to do research because they're hard to find. But we know we have this long road ahead of us, both with research and with management. The bottom line, kill spotted lanternfly if you can, but use recommended practices. Make sure you're doing safe things and you're not reactively choosing something that might not be safe. Report it. Wherever you are, to whoever the appropriate authority is, please report it. We want to know where it is. And absolutely don't move them around. You don't want them to get it into any more areas. We're very nervous about what would happen if they would get into the Pacific Northwest or the Central Valley of California, and certainly into some of the other, especially grape producing areas of the country. So I have a lot of people to thank for all the work that they've done that helps me make these kinds of presentations from all over. And I'm going to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Emelie, for a fantastic presentation. We do have some questions from the audience here. So let's jump right in. First question is, how do you get rid of them from a plant once you find them? So I know we talked about some egg scraping, but if you find some nymphs or adults, what's the best way to get rid of these bugs?
Yeah, if you can destroy them mechanically. So scraping eggs is a mechanical method. If you can use circle traps, you can catch thousands of nymphs in those circle traps. But even, you know, people have used fly swatters. I've heard of people using vacuum cleaners to just, you know, suck them up and then just leave them in the vacuum cleaner for a couple days, and they won't have any moisture and they'll die in there. Use those kind of mechanical methods first. If you need to use some sort of spray, try to use those lower toxicity products first. Insecticidal soap, something you buy at the garden center, it works pretty well. They don't die a sudden dramatic death. They don't like it. They'll jump away from you and you might not actually see them die. They may die in a couple hours, you know, somewhere at the bottom of the plant, but it works pretty well. So I would suggest insecticidal soap for, you know, most uses. You want to get it at the garden center. We really don't want you to use any kind of soaps that are, you know, for dishwashing or any kind of other things, because they have other stuff in them. They have detergents, they have fragrances, and there's no recommendations for how much you can use safely on the leaves of the plants. Sometimes they have antibacterial products in them. Use things you get at the garden center.
Thanks, Emelie. And we've got another question here, which is, do birds eat spotted lanternfly?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of our graduate students is doing a whole project on that, and she has a Facebook page, Birds Biting Bad Bugs, I think is how you will find it. And she's asking for citizens to report when they see other creatures and especially birds, but she has some accounts of other creatures like squirrels eating them as well on there. And she's trying to collect that information. So we have seen birds eating them. I've heard of people reporting cardinals eating them and a variety of other birds as well. So we'll see, maybe the birds will get more and more fond of them and help us as part of the control puzzle.
And do any other insects have similar egg masses? If folks are scouting for egg masses and looking to remove them, would they need to be careful to not scrape egg masses that they find?
Yeah, there are beneficial insects that have egg masses that are sometimes confusing, you're not sure. I think the best place for that information is that Virginia extension fact sheet that I referenced earlier. And you can find those fact sheets pretty easily, and they have really good pictures of what those other egg masses might look like. At the same time, though, there are insects that are, other invasive insects that you can destroy egg masses that you find because you also know what they are. So the insect formerly known as gypsy moth, now the new common name looks like it's going to be spongy moth, has a very distinctive looking egg mass. But I have found them on the same trees as spotted lanternfly egg masses and on flower pots and some other, solid objects. And if you're destroying spotted lanternfly egg masses and you find a spongy moth egg mass, you can also destroy that. And that's, a good thing that you're getting rid of another invasive.
Thank you, Emelie. So we've got a couple questions here kind of that coordinate around collective efforts. So are there any coordinated quarantine efforts that go across state lines similar to the Asian longhorn beetle or emerald ash borer? And is it connected to the EPA? And is there awareness for moving things like stones and things like that across state lines?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of work being done in that area. The agency that I'm most familiar with is the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They're inspecting things that are leaving the ports of the areas that have the infestation, and they're inspecting things that are coming in from other parts of the world, into ports. And they do this work all the time. So there's port inspections, but there's also a lot of work being done along transportation corridors that are, over land. So the USDA and our Pennsylvania Department of Ag, I'm sure some of the state Department of Ags in other states are also doing this. They're trying to target railroad corridors, taking down tree of heaven, using some spray treatments in these very targeted areas to try to keep them from hitching rides on vehicles like that. So the agencies are hard at work at this. In Pennsylvania, we also have a dog that's trained to sniff out the egg masses, and that dog is being used to find any egg masses before they get shipped. So, of course, we don't have a lot of dogs. We could have a lot more out there working, but it's really cool that we know that dogs can do that, and there's a way to train them. So those are just some examples of what's being done, but a lot of people are working on that. And then this whole awareness piece that you're helping us with today, everybody that's out there can be part of this. Please tell people that you learned about Lanternfly today, help them understand why it's important, and teach them what these things look like. So if you have anybody that that's moving, just a homeowner or a resident can move equipment or outside objects to other areas and easily start a new infestation. So yes, we're coordinating it on like all levels, and a lot of work is being done.
Excellent. Fascinating about the bug sniffing dogs. Yeah. I think that would be very cool to see. We've got a question here. Are there any other invasive species and successful controls that you can compare this to, like gypsy moths, for example?
Yeah. So there's all kinds of invasives, and I'd like to just start answering that question by reminding everybody that it's a worldwide problem. So we have a lot of invasives here in the U.S., but also other countries, other continents have invasives that came from North America. And, you know, it's just because of the way we live. We move goods around the globe all the time. So, yeah, you know, and I think as new waves of like a new invasive moves into an area, I think we're getting maybe better at it, better at what to do. I think with emerald ash borer, I don't know that we ever had a chance with that one. People worked very hard to try to keep it from getting, you know, like out to the East Coast and stuff. But I think we didn't have a lot of our mechanisms in place. The Extension Service certainly did a lot of education. But when Lanternfly came around, it seemed like we were just ramped up a little better in our ability to respond, both from the education standpoint and the research standpoint and the control, like operation standpoint. So, so this is not the last invasive that will come around, and hopefully, you know, the next time we get another one, we'll be even more prepared. But there's a lot of discussion about that. You know, how do we put systems into place where we're prepared to act as soon as we know it's here, and we don't have like a delay time in that respect. So I don't know if that answers your question, but every time we get a new invasive, I think we're getting a little better at knowing how to deal with it.
Yeah, I think that does answer the question. Thank you, Emelie. And another question here is there any scenario where we can coexist with a spotted lanternfly or any invasive insect that comes en masse like this?
Yeah, well, it's probably not by choice, but I think we're being forced to do that. So the lanternfly, you know, early on when it was in a very small part of Pennsylvania, we had some enthusiasm that maybe we could eradicate it. We've really gone past that, and we're more into how do we manage it and how do we prevent it from getting further mode right now. So that slide I showed with the bubbles, you know, can we manipulate biological control, taking into account weather factors? Can we discourage them by removing favored host plants? And then the control measures, if we're using insecticide practices in kind of a judicious way in critical areas, are there ways that we can learn to live with it, yet prevent it from being an economic problem for our agricultural producers, and also not be such a nuisance in ornamental landscapes? So we're moving into that phase with lanternfly. And we mentioned emerald ash borer. We're definitely we've moved into that phase with emerald ash borer. In the eastern part of Pennsylvania, you know, the ash trees have been killed, and now we're trying to just deal with the fact that we have standing dead trees to deal with. So we've moved past, you know, ever trying to think we're going to get rid of it, and now we're just trying to concentrate on public safety. So yeah, I think not by choice, but we eventually, with most of these issues, have to learn how to live with it.
Well, thank you so much, Emelie, for this excellent and informative presentation. And thank you everyone for attending today's program.